Hello. We this weekend looking at the upcoming scriptures for the third Sunday of Easter. The readings, as I mentioned before, the first reading comes from Acts, this time from chapter 5, verses 27 through 32, and then it jumps to verses 40b to 41. Second reading is from the book of Revelation, chapter 5, verses 11 through 14, and the gospel is from the Gospel of John, is the 21st chapter, verses 9 through 19. Now, what I would like to look at today is this 21st chapter of John's Gospel. As you know, and you might remember from our looking at the discussion of John's Gospel last week, the 20th chapter ends with the verses, "Many other signs and wonders Jesus did that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Lord." And it seems like a very appropriate ending to John's Gospel. And now we come to chapter 21. And there is a certain discussion goes on among those who consider these things as to whether or not chapter 21 originally belonged to John's Gospel, or whether it was an addition. Although admittedly, the majority of viewpoints say that if it was an addition, it was made to John's Gospel very shortly after the work was completed. So what we're going to examine a little bit now, keep in mind that this is the purpose of these discussions, is to look to see kind of the full message of a particular episode in the gospel tradition. The 21st chapter begins, and maybe it would be appropriate to say that in a certain way this chapter might be considered to be an epilogue. See, rather than an addition. You remember what an epilogue is. You read a novel, you read a book, and after the main part of the material is presented, then there's a kind of little conclusion. The epilogue begins by the fact that the disciples return to Galilee. Now, it's interesting in John's Gospel that there's no mention of the disciples returning to Galilee, and the members who return are named, namely Simon Peter, Thomas called, and I think appropriately the translation here, sometimes in church you hear Didymus, and I ask you, well, what does Didymus mean? But its translation is the twin. So Thomas the twin. Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, who are not named, but we know that the sons of Zebedee would be John and James, and two other disciples, two others. Now, when one looks at that, one notices that one comes up with 7 disciples. One of the unnamed disciples may well be the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple. In John's Gospel, he is never named. So we don't really ever know who this disciple is, only that he bears that particular designation. Peter says, "I'm going fishing." Now, this is the first time in John's Gospel that we know what the occupation of the disciples were. You're saying, oh, we know that. Yes, you know that because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are called as fishermen to become fishers for people. And remember, that's very much a part of the story beginning in the early chapters of those 3 Gospels. So we now discover that Peter says, "I'm going fishing," and the others agree to go with him. Now, whether or not they were all fisher persons, we don't know. We only assume that they were. And so they all get in a boat, and the next line says that they apparently go fishing at night. Now, it is true, those of you who are fisher people will understand this a little bit, that there are certain times of the day when the fish are more easily able to be caught. And apparently one of them is just before dawn, or not in the deepest, darkest part of night, but as the day breaks, apparently the fish are coming alive and they're more able to be caught. Anyway, as they are bringing their boat in, having not been successful, there is one standing on the shore. Now, it's named the Sea of Tiberias. Only in this gospel does that title given. That's the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Gennesareth. A Jewish community would have avoided Tiberias because the city of Tiberias, you remember, had been built by Herod Antipas as a kind of tribute to Rome, and particularly Tiberius. Of course, the emperor was Tiberius, and he hoped that it would become a kind of enjoyable place for people to come, kind of to enjoy being on the lake and the various things that could go on. So all of that's background as to why, and for whatever reasons, John does name it as the Sea of Tiberias. He calls out, this standing figure, to the disciples, "Have you caught anything?" And they say, "No." And, then this voice says, "Cast your net to the right side of the boat and you will get a catch." Well, apparently the disciples, following the advice that is given them, do just this, and suddenly their net is full almost to the breaking point, although the net doesn't break. It's at this point that the disciple whom Jesus loved identifies that the person standing on the shore is none other than Jesus. And when Peter hears this from the disciple whom Jesus loved, now keep in mind there are some connections here in chapter 21 to chapter 20. You'll remember that on Easter morning, when Mary Magdalene had come to announce that the tomb was empty, Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved ran to the tomb, checked it out. So here they are, again, two spokespersons for the gospel message. When Peter hears the declaration on the part of the other disciple that it is Jesus, he jumps into the water and apparently throws on a little bit of extra clothing because, well, I guess he didn't have too much on as he was fishing. Now, the gospel says that the others came ashore. They were only about 100 yards from shore. So when you think that Peter jumps into the water and has to swim a great deal, that isn't really what happens. He probably could walk in from that point. Now, when they come on shore, their recognition that this is Jesus has happened. And there is Jesus sitting around a charcoal fire, baking, or whatever you do on a charcoal fire, with fish and bread, and says to the disciples, "Come and eat." Come, well, literally, come and have breakfast. He then says, "Bring some of the fish that you have caught." Well, at this point, Peter goes to the net with the fish, and John gives an interesting number. He says 153 fish, large fish, were in the net. Now, just exactly, and there's much discussion that goes on about what this number means. You kind of have to smile a little bit to say, before Peter took any of the fish out, did he sit down and start counting them? 1, 2, 3, so that he knew how many fish he caught. What's the purpose of this? And by the way, let me say right off the bat that nobody knows for sure what the meaning of the 153 fish is all about. There are a couple of interpretations. We can look at those, but nobody knows, even though there are those who make claims that this is the meaning of why this number was given. Anyway, they now have breakfast with Jesus, and the gospel writer says this was the third time that Jesus appeared after his resurrection. Now, right away, there's problems here. After all, if you go back to remembering in chapter 20, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene in the morning, to the disciples on Easter evening. A week later, to the disciples, when Peter, remember Thomas rather, was absent and now he's there. But when you think about it, on Easter Day, there are 3 times that Jesus appears. One in the morning, one in the evening, and one the next week. So what is this appearance about? This is not the third appearance, but this would be a fourth. And that leads to some interesting questions as to what the purpose of this 21st chapter is in John's Gospel. Some have pointed out that if you did not have this chapter, you really don't know what happens to Peter and to the other disciple. It ends, yes, it appears to them, but why is the exclusion given to the appearance of Mary Magdalene in this sequence? Why is it not considered here? There is a viewpoint that the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection was none other than Mary Magdalene, and that she may well have been kind of the foundation or foundational person for this new movement of believers in the risen Jesus. We're not quite sure, and we need to keep in mind that although Peter and the other disciple are mentioned in this gospel, that is the 21st chapter, by the time that it had been written, Peter and that other disciple had died. So you keep in mind that the dating for the writing of the Johannine Gospel is sometime in the 90s, maybe even in the early part of the 2nd century. So after everyone has eaten and this declaration made that this was the third appearance of Jesus, you now get a story in which Jesus dialogues with the apostle Peter. And he says to Peter, we will hear this week, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, I love you. Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Yes, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? And the comment is, Peter was kind of disturbed that Jesus asked the third time, do you love me? He said, sure, truly I love you. Feed my flock. Now this is generally a scene, and of course it doesn't take a whole lot to kind of understand here. Peter had 3 times denied Jesus. Now it's his restoration by 3 times affirming his love and respect for Jesus. Notice that there are some comparisons here. Remember that when Jesus had been arrested, the disciples leave, but that the disciple whom Jesus loves follows where they are taking Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. He knows somebody there, that's the disciple, beloved disciple, and he gets allowed into that place where they have built a charcoal fire and are gathered around it. And Peter then says to a woman who is the gatekeeper, listen, I know this Peter who's standing outside, would you let him in? And so thanks to him, Peter also gathers in the around this charcoal fire. So you notice the continuance of these 2 disciples together, and they are really the main figures in the latter part now of chapter 21 of this gospel. What happens next? Peter kind of says to Jesus, now there's the reclamation, and Peter says, later on you will go, you stretch out your hands where you want, but later on you will be stretched out your hands in places that you don't want to go, but don't worry about that. And it concludes with the famous words, follow me. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned a moment ago, by the time that these episodes are written, Peter has already been executed, and we believe was executed during the persecutions of Nero in the 60s of the Common Time. So we, listening to this section, already know what, and the audience already knows what had happened to Peter, that indeed his reclamation was complete and his following and carrying out Jesus' message took place. He then asked, what about this other guy? What about the divine beloved one? Well, and here's where the word is carefully said. If I should say that he should remain until I come again, is that any business of yours? Well, the big key word is that little if. He didn't say that John would not, or that the gospel writer, we sometimes think would be the beloved disciple, would not die. But again, by the time that this had been written, John, the fourth gospel writer's beloved disciple, had died. But the point is, one keeps in mind that as this gospel ends now, the same words that had been used before, including chapter 20, are now used including chapter 21. There are many more stories that are told, but these are told that you may come to believe. Now, this will not be included in the reading for this week, those words, but that does take place. So in this latter part of the 21st chapter, you get the contrast between Peter and the other disciple. We have seen this already. There's some indication that this was true, why I mentioned John, because in the Acts of the Apostles, it is pictured that Peter and John were active in Jerusalem in the early days of the Christian experience. So is that a connection purposely made? We don't know. But we do see here that the beloved disciple seems to have the upper hand in up to this point. I mean, he gets to enter the place where Jesus is being tried. He knows the gatekeeper and recognizes him. He leads. And here, leads. What is all of this about? Feed my lambs, feed my flock, feed my sheep. This reminds us, and we will of course get in another week coming up, the image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd who says in a certain point, lays down his life for his sheep. And so here, of course, is the invitation that Peter, like Jesus, will lay down his life for the flock. And there is certainly some suggestion, and it's very clear here, that Peter is being chosen as the leader of this new community. Now, you have to be a little careful. We who are Catholics see this as Jesus setting up the first, pope. Well, we have that tradition, and that's fine. But one needs to be aware that other Christian communities are not quite so sure that's derivation is justly made. We have made it, we will stick with it. It is true that Peter is being made the leader, and we do know that he emerges as a leader for the early community, but that necessarily made him the Pope is a little bit later history within the Christian story. So all of that takes place. Back a moment, I said, well, if one looks at the 153 fish, it was St. Jerome who in the 4th century thought that 153 fish represented the total number of known fish in the world at the time. Well, that sounded good, but probably, and again, nobody really knows. Another says that we should notice that the 153 plays around with numbers. Now, as you may know, I may have mentioned this, in Hebrew, there are no numbers. So numbers are assigned to the Hebrew alphabet. So alpha, for example, which is the first, becomes 1. Beta, which is the second letter, becomes 2. So that's they assign, therefore, to letters numerical values. And some say, well, if you take the 153 and break it up and divide it, I won't go into it, but there's a very elaborate viewpoint taken on this by some modern scholars as to the kind of hidden meaning. Well, there is a certain truth that John likes to have meanings that have multiple layers of understanding, and maybe that's a point, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, just to conclude this little section, this chapter 21 establishes the permanency of the importance of Peter and, of course, the beloved disciple. One needs to notice that Mary Magdalene is gone, that there's no mention of her. And some say, of course, this would be those women who interpret this a little differently when they look at these stories, suggest that maybe the earliest Christian communities did center a bit around the proclamation of Mary, I have seen the Lord. And now, of course, as this story nicely tells us, although the disciples also had seen the Lord, but isn't it interesting that when they see this figure, remember the story began standing on the shore, that they don't recognize him. After all, if he had been there on Easter evening and 8 days later, maybe they needed a better set of glasses, but how could they not recognize him? So there are certain anomalies here which lead us to wonder just why this this last chapter, 21, has been added. As I say, most agree that it was added quite early on and may well have been written by the same writer, but there are some what do we want to say, incongruities here that make one wonder a little bit about the whole episode. So do with it what you want. Peter has emerged, and Mary's reputation only more recently has been salvaged again as an important figure in the experience of the early church. So that's chapter 21. There is a lot of material that has been developed about this. I've just kind of skirted with some of it today. Certainly, you might remember the story of the great fish catch is also found in one of the synoptic traditions, namely Luke has the same story, which leads some to wonder whether this story belongs during the lifetime of Jesus, as Luke paints it, or whether it really is a resurrection story, that it is here rightly attributed by John afterwards. Also notice that Jesus was preparing a meal, and he prepares the meal of fish and bread. Does that remind you of something in John's Gospel? Yes, in chapter 6, where you had the feeding of the large group of people. Everyone knows this story, the great abundance of bread and fish. So here it is. See, there's certain connections here that certainly make this part of the Johannine tradition, part of the Johannine understanding. By the way, at this meal on the beach, Jesus is not pictured as eating. Now, I don't know whether that was just an oversight or whether he ate with them, but he feeds the disciples. Well, there are always little rooms for interpretation here that can be made. Let's look now for a little bit at the chapter 5 of the book of Acts, okay, which is the first reading today. Now, once again, I have to point out that when we are looking at the sections of the Acts of the Apostles during this Easter season, we do get very selective. So chapter 5 pictures, and here's what's happening, that Peter and John had been arrested for teaching about Jesus by the leadership in Jerusalem. They had been told not to do this. They continued to do it, and they found themselves in jail. Then mysteriously, during the night, they are released. There are no broken doors, no jail opened, but there they are, again, right back there teaching again, and right there once more they are being arrested and brought to the leadership of the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. They are told to stop doing this. They say, but we can't because this is our mission. The leadership is kind of shaking their heads and saying, we got to do something here to stop this this happening. It's at this point that we are introduced. Now you will not hear this, and that's why I fill this in here. Interjection by one of the leaders of the Sanhedrin named Gamaliel. And Gamaliel says to his contemporaries, first put the disciples outside. I have something I want to say. Now, sometimes Gamaliel emerges as a hero. Well, maybe not. Gamaliel, after all, was part of the very group that had originally sentenced to Jesus to death. He was part of the fact that he found him guilty of this. But now he is saying, you know, fellows, before we do too much harm more to this group, maybe we should consider, you remember, and now he cites two examples of uprisings that had occurred earlier on. Namely, that there had been a movement by a fellow named Thaddeus. He had 400 men, started a movement, and he had been murdered later on, shortly. Then another guy named Judas the Galilean. He had led a revolt. He had many followers, but he too had been arrested and killed. So listen, he says, maybe we should be careful with what we do to these who proclaim the story of Jesus. Now, as I mentioned, he had been responsible for the death of Jesus in his own way. But now he is saying, you know, and here, of course, this is why he is famously remembered as the great man of historical prudence. What he advises his contemporaries, let's wait and see. After all, if like two other criminals, this criminal gets kind of eliminated, also his story and his reputation, we don't want to be guilty of, because if indeed, and he makes kind of an interesting conclusion, which is Luke's way of presenting it, Gamaliel says, if this man, if this group is truly teaching a message which is from God, then we don't want to be on the wrong side of this. And so maybe we should just let it play out. And if it's not from God, then like I mentioned, those other guys had come to a bad end, so they will come to an end. So he is often remembered for his prudence, if you want. And there's a practicality to this, which would appeal to an audience that Luke would be writing to, namely fundamentally a Gentile audience. Now, as Acts picks up that we're going to hear, they're right back there teaching, they're right back there proclaiming the goodness of the risen Jesus, and they are also ready to take whatever comes their way if that is going to be the case. So that's the connection between Acts and the gospel this time, where all of them are committed to proclaiming the good news of the risen Christ, the risen Jesus, and that's the good news that we celebrate once again this third Sunday of Easter. Glad to have you with us. Hope to see you again soon.